Good evening. I'm Jennifer Raab, and I have the great privilege of serving as the president of Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true a century and a half after our founding, whether online or on campus, as I happily am today, even in the most challenging of times. With Thanksgiving just a few days away, I want to take a moment to give thanks to all the Hunter students, faculty, and staff for your tireless and determined work to make this semester such a resounding success. Your persistence and focus, notwithstanding the COVID pandemic, is a tribute to your commitment to the historic Hunter motto, Mihi Cora Futuri, the care of the future is mine. Speaking of caring for the future, I want to also express my gratitude to the generous donors who have stepped up over the last 8 months to support Hunter and our students. Your contributions have helped us ensure that every Hunter student has the financial support and the tools they need for remote learning. You have helped keep our community fully linked and actively learning. We are deeply grateful for your help and hope you will renew your commitment to Hunter by supporting Roosevelt House Giving Tuesday appeal next week. What a perfect season and venue to be talking about the subject of today's discussion, the White House. We all know that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt lived at our 65th Street building for the 25 consequential years leading up to his 1933 inauguration and the great battle he waged to lift America from the depths of the Great Depression. Let's not forget that both FDR and Eleanor also left a major mark on the holiday of Thanksgiving. In 1939, President Roosevelt decided to move up the celebration a week to give American merchants, still struggling economically, a jump start on attracting Christmas shoppers. Well, you would have thought from the reaction that Roosevelt was taking a wrecking ball to motherhood and apple pie. His critics angrily rebranded the holiday as Franksgiving and demanded that the president retract his decision. Actually, the controversy ended with a good lesson in civic compromise, and the White House negotiated a settlement so Thanksgiving would permanently take place on the fourth Thursday of November. But leave it to Eleanor to have her own beautiful vision of this sacred American ritual. Writing in her column, My Day, 2 years later, not long before America entered World War II, she delivered a message that could just as easily have been written for our benefit yesterday. I quote, "There is so much more for which we in the United States can be thankful. We should join together and say our prayers of thanks with very full hearts. True, our lives have been changed, and some people in this country have suffered losses and are in deep sorrow because someone's life has come to an end. I like some lines which a friend of mine has sent to me. Work for peace, do your part, realize that we hold the torch of tolerance for freedom and for peace." Tonight, with those words echoing in our minds and hearts, we resume a Roosevelt House tradition that has helped to define its programming from the beginning, in-depth discussion of presidential biographies with some of the most esteemed experts in the field. The first time Roosevelt House had the pleasure of welcoming tonight's special guests more than 10 years ago, it was for a lively discussion of President Barack Obama's first year in office. One of the country's most respected journalists and historians, as well as a prominent political analyst and filmmaker, Jonathan Alter is the author of several best-selling books on the 44th president, including The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies, and The Promise, President Obama, Year One. And Jonathan Alter wrote the definitive book also on Franklin Roosevelt's breathtaking early months as president, The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days, and the Triumph of Hope. Jonathan's work as a longtime columnist and senior editor at Newsweek includes everything from Bill Clinton's first post-presidential interview to Barack Obama's first ever magazine cover story. He has written for such publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Vanity Fair, and he is now a frequent columnist for the Daily Beast, a trusted contributing correspondent on NBC News and MSNBC, and a regular on popular venues like The Daily Show and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Jonathan's commentary has also been featured in multiple award-winning documentaries, while from the other side of the camera, he produced the Emmy-winning HBO documentary, Breslin and Hamill, Deadline Artists, profiling two other pretty fair New York journalists. His newest book, which we are gathered to discuss this evening, is the groundbreaking biography, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, yet another enormous contribution to the literature of the presidency. It is the first comprehensive account of the life and work of the 39th president and Nobel Prize-winning humanitarian, Jimmy Carter. Drawing on new archival discoveries and extensive access to Carter and his family, Jonathan carefully chronicles every episode of Carter's extraordinary evolution, from his childhood on a Georgia peanut farm to global recognition as an icon of human rights. With his very best, Jonathan offers fresh and overdue perspective on a president widely considered to be among the most enigmatic in modern history, who went from a controversial single term in the White House to the longest ever and admired post-presidency in American history. As the New York Times put it, Jonathan's new book is an important, fair-minded, highly readable contribution that renders his subject with a depth rarely achieved by political journalism. To engage Jonathan Alter on this important new book, I could not be more pleased to welcome our Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House, Harold Holzer. Under Harold's guidance, Roosevelt House has continued to thrive as a national focal point for civic engagement on topics both current and historical. The last time Harold and Jonathan shared the Roosevelt House stage, it was not long after the presidential election of 2016, when they had a memorable conversation about FDR's 100 days. Folded into that exchange was a timely discussion of the importance of the president's actions and decisions during his first months in office. And now, with another presidency about to begin, we have the chance to resume the dialogue with two experts who share a special acumen for parsing the presidential past and present. A distinguished author and historian in his own right, Harold has authored or edited more than 50 books on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Only recently, we had a chance to welcome Harold to our Hunter at Home series on his newest book, The Presidents versus the Press, From the Founding Fathers to Fake News, which, by the way, features an entire chapter on Jimmy Carter. So I can't wait for Harold and Jonathan to compare notes on this president. Jonathan, Harold, thank you for speaking with us tonight. It's been 44 years since America elected Jimmy Carter, yet we know that you're going to bring an immediacy and urgency to his unique and unfinished story. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Alter in conversation with Harold Holzer. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for your commitment to our Hunter community.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And Jonathan, welcome back to Roosevelt House, albeit virtually. It's great to see you. And congratulations on the new book.
Thanks so much, Harold. First of all, I'm honored that by Jennifer's introduction and that Roosevelt House would have me. I feel like I have a treasured relationship with that place that goes back to before it was really established, and I was scouting out 65th Street when I was preparing The Defining Moment, my book about Roosevelt, because quite a bit of it actually takes place in that townhouse. And I'm grateful to you for doing this. And I have loved Abraham Lincoln since I was a small child. My mother used to bake me a cake on Lincoln's birthday, February 12th every year. It's his second birthday. And I think it's fair to say that you, of all of the Lincoln scholars in all the years since he was assassinated, you are now first among equals as the greatest Lincoln scholar this country has produced.
Thank you. Your typical Illinois childhood. You and Beschloss got cakes on Lincoln's birthday.
Yes, we did.
We didn't get anything in Queens, but that's okay. I made up for lost time. So I have a natural first question, but I'm going to defer it because there's an even more immediate one that I wanted to ask you about. And that is, by my calculation, I think I'm right, Jimmy Carter was one of only two presidents in American history who both replaced, defeated an incumbent president, and then was defeated the very next time by a challenger. I think it's Benjamin Harrison and Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
So the obvious question is, how did he handle the transition coming in? And how did he handle it as a beaten man going out? And how did Gerald Ford behave? And how did Ronald Reagan behave?
It's a very relevant question. So the transition between Ford and Carter was seamless, and they later became good friends and did a lot of projects together. So Ford had almost closed the gap in 1976, and if the election had been held even a few days later, he probably would have won. It was a very close election, decided by just a few thousand votes in Hawaii and Mississippi. And before it was clear, Hawaii and Ohio, before it was clear who had won, Ford went to bed and he had laryngitis. But first thing the next morning, instead of waiting for recounts, it was a tiny fraction of the margin in 2020, just a few thousand votes. But instead of challenging it, Ford, he had laryngitis from campaigning, and his chief of staff, Dick Cheney, call Jimmy Carter and read out a congratulations to him. And Bob Dole, who was Ford's running mate that year, was asked how it went for him the night before. And he said, "Oh, I slept like a baby, woke up every 3 hours and cried." And so, in those days, they were willing to accept defeat. And then in the transition, interestingly, Cheney, Ford's chief of staff, went into his closet and he brought out a bicycle wheel that was bent, and he gave it to Hamilton Jordan and the other senior Carter staffers, because Carter had envisioned what he called spokes on a wheel form of organizing his government, with him at the center and a bunch of people reporting to him like spokes rather than a chief of staff, which was a bad decision. And Cheney was rightly trying to warn them that Ford had tried the same thing and it hadn't worked. So they should not do this. They did not take Cheney's warning, and they got off to a rocky start, although, as I argue, and we can talk about, they got an awful lot done, much more done than people realize. And then just one more thing on that 1977 transition. Carter got out of the limo with Rosalind and Amy and the rest of his family at the Capitol after the swearing in, and he walked all the way up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. That set a new tradition. All new presidents have done this, except now except Reagan on one occasion, and they walk only the last few hundred feet. But Carter, who originated it as a sign of openness and to encourage physical fitness, did the whole thing. Then the transition from Carter to Reagan was smooth in terms of cooperation. So again, this idea of not cooperating with the incoming president, this is another Trump outrage. Carter was very cooperative with Reagan, but there was drama in that transition because Carter spent the night before the inauguration catching just a few hours sleep on the couch in the Oval Office because he was negotiating the release of the hostages. And then, as I think people remember, they were released just minutes after Reagan took the oath because the Iranians didn't want to give Carter the satisfaction of releasing them. But then, and I think this is not well known, in his inaugural address, Ronald Reagan paid tribute to Jimmy Carter and had some graceful words about this tradition of the peaceful transfer of power and a concession. Of course, Carter had conceded at 9 p.m. Eastern on election night. Now, it was a landslide, but still, both of them strongly believed in the proper transition of power. Just one more thing on this. Carter was not impressed by Reagan in the meetings that they had, thought that he was uninterested in the details of governing, and just was worried about what was going to happen to the country under Reagan. And on the ride up Pennsylvania Avenue to the swearing in, Reagan told Hollywood stories, and Carter's mind was on the hostages. Remember, they hadn't left Iranian airspace yet. And so he's talking to his aides about, have they taken off yet? And he's very focused on the hostages. Reagan, it was as if he didn't even care about the hostages. And when they got out of the limo, Carter asked an aide, "Who is Jack Warner?" Because there was some story he was half listening to about Hollywood and Jack Warner.
Well, maybe he told them the famous story where Jack Warner said, "No, Jimmy Stewart for president, Ronald Reagan for best friend," which is an amazing Hollywood story. But so Carter is at the center of two traditions that endure, which is walking along the route and also praising the outgoing president, which President Trump did, of course, was very nice about Obama when he was during the inaugural address.
Yeah, but this time I think it's fair to say that President Trump will emulate John Adams, who
Probably.
deserves enormous credit for relinquishing the presidency. He had lost to Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800. And he did something. Now, you would be a good person to ask about this. I believe it was the first time in human history that an elected leader voluntarily left office when they lost the next election, because there was just so little experience with democracy. So Adams created an enormously important precedent, and that's been respected until now. But then he couldn't stomach going to the inauguration. So he left town. He left Washington shortly before Jefferson was sworn in. I imagine that Trump will do the same.
Well, I want to go back to the beginning, but I must say, for those who have not read Defining Moment, Jonathan writes a pretty funny description of Roosevelt and Hoover's meetings in the White House. I love those stories about.
Yeah, well, Roosevelt
just did not want to engage Hoover in any cooperative bridge discussions. So.
And Roosevelt's son wanted to punch Hoover in the nose, and then on the way up Pennsylvania Avenue, it was very chilly between them, and they only exchanged 2 words when they passed the new Department of Commerce, which Hoover had headed. It was under construction, and Roosevelt said, "Nice steel," and that was it. Those are the only words they exchanged. And then Roosevelt started waving to the crowds because they had nothing to say to each other, and they had been good friends in the 20s, but never saw each other again after that.
Yeah. Well, I'll just throw in that Buchanan's only recorded word to Abraham Lincoln were, "If you're as happy taking this office as I am relinquishing it, then you're a happy man indeed." But I don't think we're going to see that. So let me go back to the beginning now. The obvious question, and I don't think I've asked you this, because we've been discussing your project for years on and off, but why, after writing about Obama and writing about FDR, what made you want to write about Jimmy Carter?
So I'm in a book group in New York, and somebody in our group knew Jason Carter, who is Jimmy's grandson. He now runs the Carter Center and had run for governor of Georgia. And Jason brought his grandfather to our book group as we were reading a book called 13 Days in September by Lawrence Wright of the New Yorker. It's about Camp David. And after this evening we spent with Jimmy Carter, who I didn't know well. I had been an intern in his speechwriting office in 1978, and I'd interviewed him once when I was a Newsweek columnist. But I hadn't particularly been following him. I was so impressed by his description of what happened at Camp David and by reading about it that I started to think there has to be more to this guy than failed president, great former president. That shorthand is just too simple-minded. And so I started to read about him, and I realized that Camp David was not anywhere near the only thing that he accomplished as president, and that he'd been kind of slimed because he lost so badly to Reagan. And there was this kind of stench that had attached itself to him. And I like sort of, the idea of revisiting parts of history that maybe have not been well explored. And then when I talked to our mutual editor, Alice Mayhew, the late Alice Mayhew, who was one of the great editors of the 20th century at Simon & Schuster. And she was Jimmy Carter's editor, not on all of his books. He wrote more than 30 books after leaving office. But she did his most recent books and some of his better books. And she was just so excited about this idea about me doing this. And it was pretty hard to say no to Alice, but I felt like this enormous hole in the line of scrimmage was opening up for me, because there have been, I counted up recently, there have been 9 biographies of Ted Kennedy, his main contemporary, and Kennedy was never president.
Right.
There have been at least a half a dozen of Ronald Reagan. Sylvia Plath, I think she has 4 biographies, right? Jimmy Carter, none? Really? And then it turns out he's led this novelistic life. It's this extraordinary American life. He's a man who effectively lived in 3 centuries. He was born in 1924 on this farm outside of Plains, Georgia, in a community of 25 people, in a feudal system, just one step up from slavery. No running water, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment. Might as well have been the 19th century. And then, of course, he's president and connected to the major social movements of the 20th century, particularly the women's movement, which we can talk about. And then at the Carter Center, they're involved in global health and democracy promotion, conflict resolution, the environment, all of the big issues of the 21st century, which until very recently, until he was 95, he's holding like 6 hours of meetings a day, figuring out how to address. So this is, I can't think of another president or even major American figure who you can say they really lived in 3 centuries. And we're talking about a guy who, at one point in his life, he went door to door for Jesus, came upon a brothel and tried to convert the madam. He raced through a melted down experimental nuclear reactor when he was in his 20s, allowed in for 90 seconds. And they thought that might kill him. He comes home after the Navy, and there's white terrorism in his community, one of the meanest counties in the Jim Crow South. Martin Luther King calls the sheriff the meanest man in the world, kind of made Bull Connor look like a nice guy, cattle prods on 14-year-old girls. So this is the sort of, to my mind, just extraordinary and for me fascinating milieu that he is coming to the presidency from.
Yeah, the boyhood is beautifully described. Before we get to it, tell our listeners and viewers, how much access did you enjoy to President Carter and to Roosevelt in your research phase?
So this was partly a function of Alice Mayhew, our mutual editor, and she smoothed the way. And so I got an extraordinary amount of access, not just to Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, but to everybody in their family. And for instance, they told Amy Carter, who now, believe it or not, is 53 years old, that she should talk to me. So she gave only her second interview that she'd ever granted to me. Before I talk about Jimmy and Rosalind, just while I'm on this subject, the Carter family was very, very colorful. Just to give you a quick example, everybody remembers Billy Carter and the Billy beer. And he, of course, he didn't actually like the taste of Billy beer. He'd pour it into the toilet and fill it up with vodka before he went out to promote it. But he was asked in 1975, when Carter was a long shot, about his family. And he said, well, I got a mother who's went into the Peace Corps at age 68. That's Lillian Carter, who was so amusing that she was on Johnny Carson all the time. I got one sister who's a holy roller. That's Ruth Carter, who became a well-known kind of new age evangelist. Another sister who rides with the Hells Angels, and I got a brother who thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I'm the only normal one in the family. So in any event, I'm asking Amy about her Aunt Gloria Carter, who not only rode with the Hells Angels, but was the den mother of the Hells Angels. And her tombstone reads, "She rides in Harley heaven." And when she was dying of pancreatic cancer, which everybody in his immediate family except Carter contracted, except Jimmy got, the Hells Angels guarded her hospital room. Anyway, I'm asking Amy about Gloria, and she said, "Well, you know, she has a tattoo." And I said, "Really? What's the tattoo? What was the tattoo of?" She was long dead by this point. And Amy says, "Tweety bird pushing a lawnmower." And, you know, when I heard that, I realized, like, this could be a really fun book to work on and a fun book to read, because these are seriously colorful and interesting people. So in any event, I spent a lot of time. I did a dozen interviews with Jimmy and Rosalind. I built a Habitat for Humanity house in Memphis with them, and he
Wow.
instructed me on how to hit nails better. And I went to Annapolis with them for his 70th reunion at the Naval Academy. I could send him emails until last year. I sent him many emails with many questions, and I'd go out for a walk. I'd come back an hour later. He would have answered all of my email questions. And I spent a fair amount of time in planes. On the email, one time I said, "Trump was an outsider. You were an outsider. Do you and Donald Trump have anything in common?" And when I got back from my walk, I had a one-word answer: no.
The timing though was impeccable. You got him while he was still able to be engaged, which
Yeah,
is
that's true.
remarkable. So
And
I
he
mean,
was all, just one other thing, Harold. He was so, and his mind continues to be very clear. He can't see, and he had a subdural hematoma last year that he had to have rehab for. So he's much reduced from when I spent this time with him. But throughout his early 90s, over the last 5 years, I could have, it was like talking to somebody who was in his 60s. I mean, he had full command of his faculties, mental faculties.
yeah, and no one will get that opportunity again. They will have to rely on you as the source. But as you remind everyone about Ms. Lillian and Billy, it's always remarkable when exceptional people spring from odd environments. I mean, you could say the same thing about Lincoln and there was no one in his family that would give hints about the greatness of the one sibling who was exceptional. But how did Jimmy Carter escape? I think you quoted Billy as saying it was a world of rednecks and white socks. And I love that line. And you also, you say this at the end of the book, that Jimmy was a barefoot boy with a moral imagination and a driving ambition to live his faith. Well, how does he do it? Is it Annapolis? Is it just his intellect? How does he become the exception in his family and in his community?
Well, he's an extraordinarily complex and layered individual, which is part of what makes him a good subject for a biography. And there were many forces at work. It started with the fact that he had three very different parents. His father, Earl, was a successful merchant and disciplinarian, extraordinarily hard worker, which he gave to his son, had a fraught relationship with his son, which eventually revolved around their different attitudes toward race. His father was a white supremacist. His mother, Lillian, an eccentric who was a nurse who treated Black patients for free. He got his interest in health from her, but she was in many ways an absent parent. The black desk in the hall, Jimmy and his sisters called Mother, because she would be off nursing someone and she'd leave instructions for them. And he was in many ways raised by a woman named Rachel Clark, who was an illiterate Black farmhand who gave him his love of nature. He became, I would argue, along with Theodore Roosevelt, our greatest environmental president. 14 major pieces of environmental legislation that he signed and would have addressed climate change in a second term had he been reelected. But Rachel also, along with his father, introduced him to, his faith, which wavered over time, and he had a born again experience when he was in middle age. But then I think there was another person who had several other people who had major influence on him. One was his teacher, Julia Coleman, who had become friendly with Eleanor Roosevelt, this spinster teacher in a small town, and she'd gone up to Chautauqua and become friendly with Eleanor. And when she was invited to the White House, it was a huge event in their town. And she was an extraordinary woman, the only teacher ever cited by name in an inaugural address. And then his uncle, Tom Watson Gordy, who was named after the great agrarian populist, the original populist, Tom Watson, who was from Georgia and was a close friend of Jimmy's grandfather. He was in the Navy, and he would send Jimmy these postcards. And Jimmy, from a very young age, wanted to go to the Naval Academy, even though nobody in his family had gone to college at all. And it took him quite a while to get in. So when he gets into the Naval Academy and goes there in the early 40s, that's when he starts to resemble the Jimmy Carter that we know. But then when he comes back after being in Admiral Rickover's Navy, where they've developed the most exciting technological project of the middle 20th century, which is attaching a nuclear power plant, which wasn't even being used on land, to the back of a submarine, right? This is what Rickover did. Colin Powell said it won the Cold War for reasons that we can talk about. In any event, he's involved with Rickover, works for Rickover. His father dies. He goes home and he takes over his father's business, Carter's Warehouse, assumes his civic responsibilities, and ducks the civil rights movement for the next 18 years. He ducks in part because out of physical fear, because those who didn't duck, they could have their businesses dynamited in one case. In some cases, he ducked for reasons of political expediency when he was running for governor. Then when he becomes governor, he changes almost overnight. He doesn't change, but he comes out of the closet as a progressive and integrates the Georgia government, moves the federal government from tokenism to genuine diversity. When he appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for instance, to the court, she was asked, when did you know you wanted to be a judge? And she said, I didn't know I could be a judge until Jimmy Carter decided half the human race had something to contribute. And he ended up appointing more women to the bench than all of his predecessors combined times 5. Figures were the same for blacks. So he's on this kind of journey. And I think a lot of what he did in the presidency and post-presidency was atonement for having ducked the great moral issue of his time. He never said anything racist, but when I questioned him about this dog whistle campaign that he ran in 1970, it was clear that it was the low point of his life. And at one point he said quietly, are we done talking about this yet? And I said, not quite yet, President Carter. But he made up for it. And I think in that sense, he's a model that we can all make up for our silence on issues of racial injustice.
One of the things you say in the book of that is that he is an engineer who is a professional engineer who's always trying to liberate the more humanist aspect of his personality. So you're saying, so he does have regret about the years when he was, turning a deaf ear to yearnings for equality in Georgia.
He won't admit to it much, and I did press him on this in various conversations, but he talks about things like my quote, late awareness. But the bottom line was, he said, look, I had a choice. I could criticize segregationists, denounce segregation, or be in politics, but I could do both. I mean, he came from one of the most conservative areas of Georgia in Southwest Georgia, Sumter County. And so, this this is part of the complexity that I think we find in a lot of major figures. Lincoln and John Lewis might be the exceptions, where they have
Well, no, Lincoln had his moments of where he faced the very same thing, which is if you don't make it clear that you're not for equality, you can't be a serious politician in 1850s Illinois. And he's often, hammered on that now by people who expect consistent enlightenment
right,
from
right.
the age of 18 on. So,
And John Lewis ran a kind of a little bit of a shady campaign against Julian Bond for the
yeah,
representative. So, and I think any serious student of historical figures knows that this complexity is what makes them interesting. You mentioned Jennifer mentioned Stephen Colbert. He has this line about Trump that I find very interesting. He says Trump is fundamentally boring. There's nothing really to figure out about Donald Trump. And Jimmy Carter is the opposite. He's a true enigma. And the more you learn about him, the more fascinating and complex it gets.
like a lot of presidents, you have to call Carter the perfect person for his moment on the stage. I don't think he would have been possible in any year but 1976, where people want a cleansing from the Watergate era. And he says, I'm Jimmy Carter, I'm running for president, I'll never lie to you. How much did the moment make the man?
Well, you're absolutely right. His advisor, Charlie Curbo, says, don't say that about lying. You're going to lose the liar vote. Every man who's ever cheated on his wife is going to vote against you. But the message was the right one. I think there's some similarities to Joe Biden this year. The message after Watergate, after the lies of Vietnam, was the right message for that time. He was the first Southerner elected since Zachary Taylor in 1848. And the only way that he could do that was that he had become a progressive governor on race and put up Dr. King's portrait in the state capitol and become very close to Daddy King. And so he was positioned to be this face of the New South. But in many ways, he was a speed bump in the traffic flows, I guess you might call them, of history. The country was moving to the right pretty sharply in the mid and late 1970s.
And the white South certainly was.
Right. And so he carried the white South in 76. No other Democrat would have beaten Ford that year because they wouldn't have, the region was already transitioning to the Republican Party. And out of regional pride, as Haley Barbour said, they voted their hearts, not their minds in 76. And he also benefited from a very positive press that year. To go to the subject of your book, he said he got a better press than he deserved in 1976. And then, even though he was doing some things that I remember as a college student not liking very much, I wasn't for him that year. I was for Mo Udall. And then when he ran for re-election, even though I'd been his intern or an intern in his White House, I was for Ted Kennedy, which was one of the dumber political things I've ever done because Kennedy should never have run against him. But when he ran, by the time he became president, the same post-Watergate press that had elevated him turned on him with a vengeance. And there was an assumption of bad faith on his part that he must be like all the rest. He must be corrupt or a hypocrite. And there were hypocritical dimensions. The human rights policy, which I believe is of great historic importance in moving the world toward democracy in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, it was hypocritical. I mean, he supported the Shah of Iran and Marcos and some other dictators, but it was also enormously effective. And the press from the start never gave him a break. So he pardons all draft dodgers on his first day in office.
Right.
Instead of the press covering this as closing a chapter, it was, well, why didn't he pardon those who were AWOL, deserters, And Jody Powell, his press secretary, I think rightly said, not only did we not get a honeymoon, we didn't even get a one-night stand.
That's a great quote. Yeah.
I think that was true.
Yeah. I mean, he also, I did a lot of reading into Carter's oral history stuff in the Carter Library. And he seemed to be pretty testy about the press and the Playboy interview issue. And he thought he was entering a Washington press corps ambiance that was really still focused on gotcha journalism, that he was going to have to be on his guard constantly. They were going to think the worst of him.
Well, he was too testy and thin-skinned as governor, where he was called Jungle Jimmy. You know, you think of this genial, Zen-like character, sharp elbows, really tough. I asked one of his sons once, what word would you use to describe him? Jeff Carter said, intense. And that really is who he is, where he, bear in on you with his icy blue eyes and his tight, angry smile. And there were a lot of reporters who were on the receiving end of that, and they did not like it.
Yeah.
So he didn't, but the Playboy interview, in his defense, he shouldn't have said it. He shouldn't have said, I lust in my heart. But it should have been like a 1 or 2 day story. I was stunned. It was like a 3-week story.
Yeah.
It went on and on. Can you imagine today? It wouldn't even last a news cycle. It would be done by dinner as a story, And so you can understand his resentment. And then on top of that, and this goes to, his religious life. And when he says, I lusted in my heart, which was the line in the Playboy interview that caused him the most trouble, guys like Billy Graham and Oral Roberts jumped all over him. And this enraged Carter and his sons because they had all been taught as young Baptists when they were baptized around 11 years old that they, quote, would lust in their hearts, and that was something that you needed to repent for because it was the sin of pride or whatever. So when these guys got up on their high horses and said, oh, he said he lusted in his heart, that's so terrible, they just couldn't believe the hypocrisy. But the capper on the story, which I love, is that after he became president, Oral Roberts, big time, evangelical Christian, started Oral Roberts University in Oklahoma. He goes to Jimmy's sister, the evangelist Ruth, and he says, we would like the president to deliver the convocation at Oral Roberts University. Could you convey that invitation to him? So Carter says to his sister, oh, you tell Oral, I'm so honored that he would invite me to that august occasion. I'm just tremendously honored. But of course, I cannot accept his kind invitation because I lusted in my heart. And that was Jimmy Carter's way of saying F you.
Right. So I know there are people who are getting questions. The great thing about this is that I wanted this to be chronological, but you are giving us this great panoramic view. No, it's great because you're covering the whole White House story anecdotally, and it's wonderful. But I do want to, because we work in a house which spawned a unique first lady who was a political leader in her own right, and we talk constantly about Eleanor's consequential 12 years in breaking tradition and setting new norms, but I don't think there's ever been a relationship. Well, FDR and Eleanor did not spend a heck of a lot of time together. You note that Jimmy missed Rosalind when she was, spending an evening giving a talk, 70 plus years, but you also paint a marriage that, had its moments of bickering and difficulties, but a unique partnership. And they called it a partnership from the start. How did they get away with it, or didn't they? Because Bill and Hillary did not quite get away with the partnership angle.
So start with, so they met each other 93 years ago. Jimmy's mother delivered Rosalind Smith, and then she brought her 2-year-old over a couple of days later to see the new baby. They started going out when he was at the Naval Academy and were married shortly thereafter. And Rosalind gave me the love letters that Jimmy wrote her from the Navy, which without question are the steamiest letters ever written between a president and a first lady in American history. And
so he lusted in more than his heart on the page.
Yes, on the page, very much so. And so I think people will find those letters interesting. They'd never been seen by anybody outside the family before this book. So then they formed this extraordinary partnership. And I think people know that Carter revolutionized the post presidency. It's less well known that he revolutionized the office of vice president. Walter Mondale was his vice president. He was the first vice president who was ever given anything to do, ever put in the chain of military command, ever given an office in the West Wing of the White House. The list goes on and with Mondale. But he also, or I should say, they also revolutionized the role of the First Lady. And Rosalind Carter was a much more powerful First Lady than Eleanor Roosevelt, because Franklin and Eleanor had, this complicated relationship, and Eleanor did important work reporting back to Franklin on how New Deal programs were going. She had a newspaper column. She held press conferences. I'm not minimizing her path-breaking quality, but Rosalind took it to a whole new level, and not just because she sat in on cabinet meetings, which was very controversial. She was a diplomat. She undertook a major diplomatic and very successful diplomatic mission in Latin America, which the New York Times called her, Ambassador Rosalind Carter, and praised her diplomatic skills. She, with the wife of Senator Dale Bumpers, Betty Bumpers, they made sure that every state had laws, or almost every state had laws, that required kids to be inoculated before they went to school. Pretty major contribution. She introduced and won passage of the first major mental health legislation in history. Remember, Hillary Care did not become law. And then she was the first advisor that he turned to. Fortunately for him and for the country, she has very good political judgment. She's a much better and savvier political thinker than her husband, by all accounts. An enormously formidable woman who almost nobody, including people on the White House staff who normally don't, have problems with the First Lady, nobody had a critical word to say about her. So they've had, and then maybe a few people, but not in the press there would be some criticism, but internally she was very well regarded, in part because you could go to her with some political advice, and then she would try to give it to Jimmy, who often wouldn't take it. He would do things that were politically so counterproductive, and that's why I describe him as a political failure, but a substantive and far-sighted success. The press judges you by how you do politically. It's the job of historians to look at the scoreboard. How did you change the country? When you did the first renewable energy bill, the first funding for renewable energy, or the first fuel economy standards, or the first cleaning up of toxic waste, or the first requirements that the contents be labeled, or that energy efficiency be labeled, literally dozens of things like this. It takes you to a new place in your assessment of the guy. And Rosalind was intimately involved in almost all of his achievements. And then after the presidency, she traveled to over 100 countries with him as they monitored elections and made peace.
So we've discussed, during our conversation, the major achievements. Talked about Camp David, which of course, all I can say to our viewers is you have to read the book to appreciate the delicateness, the finesse, the complexity, the extraordinary nature of that. The press, of course, complained about it, but that's another story. They thought that Israeli press was getting closer to the event than the American press. But Carter, he didn't make, if he had been a little more, conducted a little better outreach to the press, I think the first draft of history might have been a little different. But totally. Then the Iran crisis, inflation, gas lines, very hard to overcome that cycle. And then you talk about Ted Kennedy. So I'm with you. I was for Mo Udall in 76. I was for Ted Kennedy in 1980. It was not smart. It was fun, but it wasn't smart. And we won the New York primary. But no president can survive that kind of a challenge, right? Ford had a small challenge from Reagan at the convention in 1976, and I think that doomed him in a way.
You're right.
Did they ever forgive each other, Carter and Teddy?
Not really. I mean, Teddy is very hard on Carter in his memoirs. Carter is trying to be more gracious now. And he did confess to me that his biggest mistake, he thought his biggest mistake in office was he did not manage his relationship with the Democratic Party. And a lot of that is Ted Kennedy. And that's an important part of his job that he didn't do well. There's enough blame to go around. The outcome is kind of tragic because they could have easily agreed on a bill that was very similar to Obamacare and, saved a lot of lives if they had done it in 1978 or 79. And the story there is, I think, a pretty rich one about two men who were oil and water. Their relationship starts in the presence of Hunter Thompson, who strongly favors Carter. He became a huge Carter fan, Hunter S. Thompson, and I explained why he was so important to Carter first getting elected. And then it has all of these interesting ups and downs because Carter and Kennedy worked together on some very important legislation on trucking deregulation, airline deregulation. Now you might say, well, is deregulation good? In this case, it actually was. So trucking deregulation, for instance, created a lot of what they call just-in-time delivery, a lot of what we think of as the sort of structure of our domestic economy now. And then when Carter normalized relations with China and created with Deng Xiaoping what became the most important bilateral relationship in the world and the foundation of the global economy. So these long-term dimensions that I try to get at. But yes, he could have done a much better job in the way he handled the press and the way he handled his fellow Democrats. I still think his biggest mistake was succumbing to pressure, which he knew instinctively knew was wrong, to allow the deposed Shah of Iran into the United States for medical treatment at New York Hospital. And if
hastening the revolution,
well, the revolution had taken place earlier,
but hastening the condemnation of America and the hostages.
They took the hostages just a few days after that, and as a direct result. And when they had first tried to get the Shah in, Carter said, "F the Shah." I said, did Carter talk that way? I asked Harold Brown, who died not long after I interviewed him, who was defense secretary. And he said, yeah, I was kind of surprised to use the F-bomb, but so he knew that he shouldn't do this. But the Rockefellers hoodwinked Carter into believing that he could not get adequate medical care in Mexico. So he made this fateful decision to let him in. And I tell that story in some parts of it for the first time.
It was revelatory. I'm just going to very quickly say that my view of the low point was, of course, when he fired Bella Abzug, my former boss, as the head of the National Women's Commission. But he also created the National Women's Commission, and he created the event that she chaired in Houston, which we've all seen now on miniseries.
Just one thing on that's really on Rosalind. So she didn't like Bella Abzug, and they didn't like the fact that she was a presidential appointee with an office in the White House, and she would go out on the lawn and she would trash the administration, which they didn't think was.
You call that a reason to let someone go? I know we're running way past our time. I could keep talking to you, but I want Mac to come in because I see we have a lot of audience questions lined up. Mac, over to you.
Hello, Harold. Hello, Jonathan. This has been excellent. And we do have some questions from the audience that I'll share with you now. The first is from none other than Charles Kirsch, Harold's grandson, asking if, John, you'll speak a little bit more about the interviews you conducted with President Carter and the interactions that you had with him while writing the book.
So I interviewed him in several places, and I guess one of the more memorable would be at lunch, when we were building that house, or to say I was building it, I put in quotation marks because I wasn't exactly a wizard with the hammer. I think the most relaxed interviews and the longest interviews were at his home in Plains. And, he made all the furniture. I mean, the man has so many different skills. He has a book of poetry. Some of the poems aren't half bad. And he wrote a novel, a children's book. I go through his many skills make me tired just thinking about all the things that he knows how to do. But when you talk to him, you do get this, even if you know, as I did, that there's this intensity beneath the surface, and that his inner engineer is always in some conflict with his inner humanist. Uh, on the surface, there is a kind of a Zen-like quality to him, and I think he's at a very good place now, which he was not when he left the presidency. He was depressed for a time, and he feels like he used to memorize this poem. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I asked him, "Are you the master of your fate and the captain of your soul? You didn't used to be." And he said, "I am." And I believed him. He had, which is, I think, all that anybody can ask for from a life. We can't all lead this life of a world-class humanitarian and get as much done and save as many lives as he has. I mean, guinea worm disease, they took it down from 3 million cases to 30 through the efforts of the Carter Center. But I don't think he's humble, because I don't think any politician is ever humble, but there's a modesty to him that when you meet him is just extraordinary. And my wife felt this too. And, until just a couple of years ago, you could find him cutting the grass at their church, and Rosalind would be vacuuming the sanctuary. And we went to like a church supper with them, and their interactions in that town of Plains of 650 people is really extraordinary to watch, the human scale. He's not a larger than life figure who sucks up all the oxygen when he walks in the room. He's not that kind of presence, but there is a different, quieter grace that comes through, and ultimately it's the decency, the core decency of the man, for all of his shortcomings, that's always there for a visitor to find.
Our friend Katrina Vanden Heuvel has a comment, more so than a question, for you to respond to.
Okay.
She says, President Carter seemed a student too heavily influenced by Tudor Brzezinski, yet he was also a president who launched the first human rights office in State Department headed by Pat Darien. Seems the latter influence has played more of a role in defining Carter, the best living ex-president, as we called him at The Nation in the cover story in 1990. The best, largely as a result of the Carter Center's understanding of the 21st century security framework. The center isn't by any measure influenced by the Brzezinski hawkish Cold War / Trilateral Commission influence. And then she apologizes for the length of the comment.
Well, first of all, thank you for that thought, Katrina. And Katrina's father, William Vanden Heuvel, was in the Carter administration. He was an early supporter of Jimmy Carter. He was tremendously helpful to me on this book, as he was on the book about FDR. And I'd be interested to hear him on this. I don't believe that he was unduly influenced by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was his national security advisor, who I also interviewed not long before his death. A lot of trees died covering the print story of the rivalry between Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and National Security Advisor Brzezinski. I didn't spend a huge amount of time on it because Jimmy Carter was so hands-on in foreign policy, so smart and so self-assured that he was essentially his own Secretary of State. Now, and he said that he actually agreed more with Vance than Brzezinski. Brzezinski eventually won that bureaucratic knife fight, but I found many examples of Carter rejecting Brzezinski's advice, most significantly to back a coup in Iran to bolster the Shah, so-called Option C, which Brzezinski wanted. And in terms of the way they responded to the Soviet Union, I mean, boycotting the Olympics and the grain embargo, they were both disastrous ideas politically, although they overwhelmingly passed Congress at the time. But, he didn't go to war. And for him to have just ignored the invasion of Afghanistan, I don't think even outside of a Cold War context would have been the right move. It made sense for him to show some firmness. He chose the wrong means to do so. And he stood up for peace as president. As he said rightly to me, he could have bombed Iran and been reelected, but he knew that the hostages would likely die. And he was very happy to have gotten them all home safely. So he's willing to take the hit as a, quote, weak president in order not to cost American lives. So did he increase defense spending? Yes. One of the things I say to Reaganites is that some of the weapons that were given a lot of credit for intimidating the Russians, especially the B-2 bomber, were built in the Carter administration, in the Carter Pentagon. And then they came online, under Reagan. So yes, he used some hawkish rhetoric after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but that was the first time they had invaded a country outside their immediate sphere of influence in Eastern Europe since World War II. So for the United States to have not responded to that, I think would have been a mistake. So yes, he was in the mainstream of Cold War American presidents. He didn't deviate all that much from that. But what the human rights policy did was to set for the first time a global standard, for the first time in human history, a global standard on how governments should treat their own people. It used to be basically none of another government's concern. And Carl Deutsch, the very well-regarded professor of international relations at Harvard, he saw Carter shortly after the presidency when Carter was kind of depressed. He ran into him and he said, look, 1,000 years from now, there are very few presidents who will be remembered. You will be one of them because of human rights, because of the flag you raised for human rights, which, by the way, even Reagan did not repeal the human rights policy. George W. Bush, he essentially took it too far almost in trying to democratize the Middle East with the Iraq War. But until Trump, it was embedded in American foreign policy, and it will be again under Biden. So this is a major contribution.
CH asks, when did Carter know he wanted to be president?
So I don't think he really knew that he wanted to be president until 1971 or 72. His ambition in life was to be chief of naval operations. And that was what he was very focused on when he was young. And then he gets elected governor, which was a real long shot. And he suddenly is meeting the candidates for 1972, the would-be candidates, all these senators, Muskie, Kennedy, McGovern, Humphrey. And he's starting to think, you know what, I'm as smart as these guys, and I know more about domestic affairs because I'm where the rubber meets the road. I'm a governor, and they're in the Senate, and they just know about bills. They don't see what happens to the bills after they're implemented. So that's when he started to think about it. And then the same week that Nixon won in a landslide in 72, he started planning. He was a planner. He was the founder of planning commissions in Southwest Georgia. And the inner engineer is a very important part of Carter. And I think he, with Hamilton Jordan, started to engineer a run for president. And it was the first time he thought seriously about it in that period. Of course, there are limitations to being an engineer. In corporations, the engineer usually falls just short of being CEO. So I see Carter in many ways as a visionary without being a genuine natural leader, because that engineering quality where he thought, if we just get to the right answer, everybody will come along. That's not really the way it works in politics. And he never fully understood that.
Susan Weisfield asks if it's true that Reagan reversed some of the environmental regulations from the Carter administration, setting a precedent for consecutive administrations following that. And has Carter ever commented on Reagan's environmental policies?
Yeah, so Carter had very fraught relations with his successors, especially Bill Clinton, which I get into in the book. But with Reagan, it was just radio silence. Like they didn't deal with each other at all. The Carters thought that Reagan made racism easier, and that he gave people permission to be bigoted, and they really have nothing nice to say about Reagan. But on the environment, interestingly, regulations can be changed, but laws, it's much harder to change laws. And Carter got a lot of laws through, I think people know about Superfund, but there were many, which cleans up toxic waste sites, but there were many other laws that he got through to clean up water and air and chemicals that Reagan couldn't touch, even if he had polluters as head of the EPA. And we're going to find that now too. Trump did some damage, repealed some regulations, but most of it is reparable because he wasn't able to change laws. And this was most important on a conservation issue. So sometimes presidents act by executive order to protect land. And initially, Carter was going to do that. He did do that in Alaska, but he realized that could be repealed by future presidents. So he got the Alaska Lands Bill through at the end of his presidency, which doubled the size of the National Park Service, protected 105 million acres. And with the exception of just 1 or 2% of it, which is called the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, which gets all the attention, and which under legislation presidents have some leeway on. And so Trump is starting to try to drill there. But even there are real limitations because of the Alaska Lands Bill. Meanwhile, all of this other land, the other 98%, is protected and is an enormous contribution. And then he did the same with parts of the redwood forest, which were unprotected. He protected them for the first time. Anybody who lives in California should thank Carter for in the Santa Monica Mountains, outside LA, that's all protected. The list just goes on and on and on, and most of them were permanent. The one thing that he wasn't able to do is at the end of his time in office, the Council on Environmental Quality gave him a report on what was then often called carbon dioxide pollution. It was something in the scientific community that Carter had underlined articles in science journals in the early 70s when he was governor about global warming. Other presidents played golf and he read scientific journals, right? So he was getting aware about this issue. And at the very end of his presidency, they give him a recommendation on what the policy should be. Of course, he leaves office, but if he had been reelected, the US policy would have been identical to the Paris Climate Agreement of 2016 in terms of the reduction in CO2. So he was very farsighted on the environment.
Is it okay if we do 2 more?
We can do as many more as people want to stay for.
Okay, so a couple people are asking about Israel-Palestine, including Harold Hand and Janet Levine. I'm sorry, I mixed up the questioners, Arthur and Janet Levine. Could you comment on Carter's views and approach to the conflict in Israel-Palestine?
So I make a rather unusual argument in this book that Jimmy Carter was the greatest president for the security of the state of Israel since Harry Truman. Um, and the reason for that is Camp David, which would not have been possible without Carter. Whatever somebody like Alan Dershowitz says, it's just, he's completely full of it on that. So he, as Begin said, was responsible for that deal. The Egyptian army was the only force powerful enough to drive Israel into the sea. When I was a Jewish kid growing up in Chicago, we were always told Israel's being in danger of being driven into the sea. The Egyptian army was the only one that could do that. They had tried 4 times in 30 years. There hasn't been a shot fired in anger between Israel and Egypt in the last 42 years since Camp David. However, Jimmy Carter is rhetorically the most pro-Palestinian president that we have ever had. And he felt that it was unfinished business from Camp David that he had hoped to address in a second term, a comprehensive Middle East peace leading to a Palestinian state. And so he's worked for that, sometimes in very self-destructive ways in the years since. In 2006, he came out with a book with the title Palestine, Peace or Apartheid. And even though Israeli politicians like former Prime Minister Ehud Barak used that word apartheid, and you can hear it to this day in the Knesset, when Carter used it, it really hurt him. And I remember having objections to it at the time. But to my mind, deeds are more important than words. So the deeds of Camp David, and he had to go back to the region 6 months later, put the whole deal back together again with chewing gum and baling wire when it fell apart. So he deserved the Nobel Prize at the time. He didn't get it, but when he eventually got it in 2000, it was in part making up for the fact that he deserved it for Camp David.
Jeff Gitlin asks you to comment on the malaise speech.
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter on that. The first thing to know about it is he never used the word malaise. In fact, I'm not sure that malaise has ever passed his lips. It's not in the speech. It was called the Crisis of Confidence speech. And it was described by Pat Cadell, his pollster, as the malaise speech. So the press picked up on it. This was one of the most extraordinary speeches ever given by an American president. The context was that because of the gas lines, the gas crisis of June of 1979, when there were these long lines for gas, and John Updike wrote in a novel, gas stations closed up like someone died, and that's the way it felt. And people's attitude toward their cars was like our attitude now toward their phones. It was just unimaginable that they couldn't drive where they wanted. And so Carter, who had been as high as 74% in 1977, 30 points higher than Trump ever got, was suddenly down in where Nixon was when he resigned, in the mid 20s in popularity. And he was scheduled to give yet another speech about energy. And he and Rosalind realized they just couldn't do that. And so they gave this speech about, it was really like a sermon about a crisis of confidence in the country and how we had sort of lost our way as a nation. It started out talking about everything he had done wrong. And the confessional tone of the first part of the speech is extraordinary in the Trump era, where he just gives himself A+ for everything. The speech was actually popular. Again, a misconception. He went up in the polls after delivering the speech, but then he made a terrible decision a few days after the speech, and he fired half of his cabinet, and his numbers plummeted, and the malaise speech was seen as a mark against him. But it's a fascinating period in his career.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, but I will share with you before we go a comment from David Alpern, who I take it as maybe a former colleague of yours.
Great colleague.
Yeah, he says for Newsweek that he covered Carter's coming out at the '74 Kansas City Democratic mini convention. And he recalls afterwards walking down a rainy street with Carter, and Carter saying that he wasn't so sure where he stood in the presidential sweepstakes, but that, quote, nobody will work harder. He seemed so
Yeah.
sincere, says David.
Yeah, well, that's actually a good place to end. And I'm so glad that my terrific old colleague David Alperin brought this up, because that idea, the book is called His Very Best, and not only is that on the Nobel Prize citation, and it's connected to the title of his first book, Why Not the Best, but it's the subject of his prayers to do his best. And whenever he fell short, at least he could say to himself that he was always all in. I mean, even when he was on Miller time, like doing some form of recreation, and he's very avid, fisherman and all kinds of other sports, he was always totally committed. And long after others left the field in terms of trying to, better the world, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were still out there trying to make things better. So, sometimes people go, well, effort is fine, but results are what counts. And I argue that there were a lot more results than people realize for all of the shortcomings, but that the effort itself is something that, along with the core decency, that we can learn from.
That's terrific. While we've been on, some news has broke. The GSA has greenlit the transition.
Oh,
Really?
that's good.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, we'll remember this event for that,
Yes.
but also for, Jonathan, you've taken such a complex new approach. It's just so illuminating, and you did a great job this evening. And I just want to remind people that they do a little shilling here, that they can order the book through our chat function, and it comes with a signed book plate from Jonathan Alter. We can't do a traditional book signing, but I think when we get back from this pandemic, we're going to have all of the terrific authors who have spent time with us during this pandemic and have a book fair at Roosevelt House with our usual wine reception, because we really miss seeing you, John, and having you with us. But this is the next best thing, and we thank you.
Thanks, Harold. And if people want, to buy the book for Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever for somebody, and they want another book plate, feel free to get in touch with me. Go to my website and you can email me, and I will happily send you more book plates. So thanks so much for having me, Harold. I really appreciate it.
It was great. And thanks, Mac, and thanks everybody. Good night.
Good night.